By the late 1800s, Europe was dividing Africa. Britain was expanding. France was expanding. Belgium had taken Congo. Germany had colonies. Portugal had territory. Italy wanted its own empire too. Across the continent, borders were being drawn, kingdoms were being invaded, and African lands were being claimed by foreign powers. But in 1896, one African nation refused to fall: Ethiopia. On March 1, 1896, near the town of Adwa, Ethiopian forces faced an invading Italian army. To many Europeans at the time, the result seemed obvious. Italy was a European power. It had modern weapons. It had colonial ambition. And it believed Ethiopia could be forced into submission. But what happened at Adwa shocked the world. Ethiopia did not collapse. Ethiopia did not surrender. Ethiopia won. This was not just a battle between two armies. It was a battle over sovereignty, a battle over dignity, a battle over whether an African nation could stand against European colonial power and survive. And the answer Ethiopia gave was unforgettable. This is the story of the Battle of Adwa, a victory that changed Ethiopia, inspired Africa, and became one of the greatest symbols of resistance in modern history. To understand Adwa, we have to understand the world Ethiopia was facing. The late 19th century was the age of empire. European powers were racing to control African land, resources, trade routes, and people. This period became known as the Scramble for Africa. To Europe, Africa was being treated like a map to be divided. But to Africans, these lands were home. They had histories, kingdoms, cultures, religions, armies, diplomacy, and leaders who understood what was happening around them. Ethiopia was one of the oldest states in the world. It had ancient Christian traditions, powerful regional nobles, and a long memory of independence. But that did not mean Ethiopia was safe. Italy was a young European nation compared to Britain and France. It had unified only a few decades earlier, and like other European powers, it wanted colonies to prove its strength. Italy had already established a presence in Eritrea, north of Ethiopia. From there, Italian ambition pushed deeper. The goal was clear: increase influence in the Horn of Africa and turn Ethiopia into a protectorate. But Ethiopia was not an empty space waiting to be claimed. It was ruled by Emperor Menelik II. Menelik was not just a traditional monarch. He was a diplomat, a strategist, a modernizer, and a leader who understood that Ethiopia needed unity if it was going to survive. He built relationships with foreign powers, he acquired modern weapons, he strengthened the state, and most importantly, he knew that European imperialism was not only a military threat, it was also a political one. Because empires do not always begin with invasion. Sometimes they begin with a treaty. And that is exactly where the crisis began. In 1889, Ethiopia and Italy signed the Treaty of Wuchale. On the surface, it looked like an agreement of friendship. But hidden inside the treaty was a dangerous disagreement. The Amharic version and the Italian version did not mean the same thing. In the Ethiopian understanding, the treaty allowed Ethiopia to use Italy in foreign relations if it wanted to. But in the Italian interpretation, Ethiopia was required to conduct foreign relations through Italy. That difference changed everything, because Italy claimed the treaty made Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. Menelik rejected that claim. For Ethiopia, this was not just a legal issue. It was an attack on sovereignty. If Italy's interpretation was accepted, Ethiopia would no longer be fully independent. Its foreign policy would be controlled by another country. Its voice in the world would be taken. And Menelik understood what that meant. So he refused. And when diplomacy failed, the road to war opened. Italy believed Ethiopia could be pressured. Italy believed Ethiopia could be divided. Italy believed a European army would defeat an African empire. But Italy misunderstood Ethiopia. Because when the threat became clear, Ethiopia did something powerful. It united. Italy expected weakness, but Ethiopia prepared strength. Menelik II called on regional leaders, nobles, warriors, and communities to defend the country. And they came, from different regions, different backgrounds, different power centers. They came because this was not simply Menelik's war. It was Ethiopia's war. A war to protect independence. One of the most important figures in this moment was Empress Taytu Betul. Taytu was not just a symbolic figure beside Menelik. She was politically sharp, deeply patriotic, and strongly opposed to Italian expansion. In Ethiopian memory, she stands as one of the great figures of Adwa. She understood the danger of surrendering national independence. She supported resistance, and she helped shape the spirit of defiance that carried Ethiopia toward battle. This matters because Adwa was not won by one person alone. It was won by unity. Menelik was central. Taytu was central. Regional commanders were central. Ordinary fighters were central. Women who supported the campaign were central. Communities that supplied food, logistics, and courage were central. That is what made Ethiopia dangerous to Italy. Italy did not face a small, isolated force. It faced a mobilized nation, and Ethiopia's army was not as backward as Italy wanted to believe. Menelik had worked to obtain modern rifles and equipment. Ethiopian forces were familiar with the terrain. They were motivated by defense of homeland, and they were fighting under leaders who understood both politics and war. Meanwhile, the Italian army was under pressure. Italy wanted a quick victory. Its leaders wanted prestige. Its colonial officials wanted expansion. Its commanders wanted to force Ethiopia into submission before Ethiopia's mobilization became too strong. The Italian commander, General Oreste Bartieri, faced a difficult situation. He was operating far from home. His forces were stretched. His information was imperfect, and he was under political pressure to act. That pressure would prove costly. By early 1896, both sides were near Adwa, in the mountainous region of northern Ethiopia. The terrain was difficult. The movement was complicated. The stakes were enormous. For Italy, victory could mean colonial dominance over Ethiopia. For Ethiopia, defeat could mean the loss of independence. There was no small outcome here. This was the kind of moment that decides history. And on the night before the battle, the Italian army began moving. The plan was to advance in separate columns and attack Ethiopian positions. But in the mountains around Adwa, coordination was difficult. Units became separated. Communication became confused. The landscape worked against them, and Ethiopia was ready. As the sun rose, the battle began. March 1st, 1896, Adwa. The Italian army advanced, but the plan quickly started to fall apart. The columns were not properly coordinated. Some units moved too far. Some lost contact. Some found themselves isolated. And once Ethiopian forces recognized the opportunity, they attacked with full force. This was not the battle Italy expected. Ethiopian soldiers fought with intensity, discipline, and determination. They knew what was at stake. They were not fighting for territory alone. They were fighting so Ethiopia would remain Ethiopia. Italian units were overwhelmed one by one. The battle became a disaster for Italy. By the end, Ethiopia had won a decisive victory. A European colonial army had been defeated by an African empire on African soil. That outcome shook the world, because Adwa challenged one of the biggest myths of the colonial age, the idea that European power was unstoppable. Ethiopia proved that it was not. The victory forced Italy to recognize Ethiopia's independence. It preserved Ethiopian sovereignty at a time when much of Africa was under European colonial rule. But the meaning of Adwa went far beyond Ethiopia. Across Africa and the African diaspora, Adwa became a symbol. It showed that resistance was possible. It showed that unity mattered. It showed that colonial power could be challenged. For Ethiopians, Adwa became a source of national pride. For Africans under colonial rule, it became a sign of hope. For the world, it became proof that history does not always move in the direction empires expect. But Adwa was not just a military victory. It was a political victory, a diplomatic victory, a psychological victory. It told the world that Ethiopia was not a colony. It was an independent nation. And it had defended that independence with courage, strategy, and sacrifice. That is why Adwa still matters, not only because Ethiopia won a battle, but because Ethiopia defended the idea that African sovereignty was real. At a time when Africa was being divided by foreign powers, Ethiopia stood and said no. No to domination, no to protectorate status, no to surrender. And that refusal became history. The Battle of Adwa was more than a clash between Ethiopia and Italy. It was a turning point, a moment when the world expected an African nation to fall, but instead watched it rise. Menelik II, Empress, Taytu Betul, Ethiopia's commanders, soldiers, and people, showed that unity could defeat empire. They showed that independence could be defended, and they showed that Africa was never simply a victim of history. It was also a maker of history. Adwa did not end colonialism across Africa, but it broke the illusion that colonialism was inevitable. It gave people a symbol, a memory, a victory. And that is why, more than a century later, Adwa still lives, not just in history books, but in national pride, in African memory, and in every story of resistance against domination. Because on March 1st, 1896, in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, an African army did what Europe thought was impossible. It won. And that victory still echoes today. If you enjoyed this story, like the video, subscribe and comment below. What historical event should we cover next?